Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are tackling one of the most wild, high-stakes, geopolitical puzzles on the planet, Taiwan. For literally decades, the whole dynamic between the United States, China, and Taiwan has been built on this very specific, kind of mind-bending concept. We can call it agreed-upon ambiguity. It's basically a setup where world powers just agree to disagree. They keep things deliberately vague on purpose just to maintain global stability. But, how does that actually work in the real world?
Well, to get it, we've got to look at this completely bizarre modern-day paradox. So on one hand, you have Beijing's stance. They emphatically state that all of Taiwan is a part of China, period. But then, you look at the reality on the ground in Taiwan. Most governments around the world don't officially recognize Taiwan as an independent country, and yet, it operates exactly like one. I mean, it's got its own flag, its own military, its own currency, and a democratically elected president who literally calls it a sovereign nation. It even controls islands that are just a couple of kilometers off the mainland Chinese coast.
And what makes this whole thing truly fascinating is how the United States handles the paradox. America is by far Taiwan's strongest partner, selling billions, with a B, in weapons to the island. But if you try to ask a U.S. official point blank, hey, would the American military actually directly defend Taiwan if China used force? You get this classic dodging response. They'll say something like, well, I never comment on that because I don't want to ever put myself in that position. They famously and intentionally dodge the question. So why is everyone tiptoeing around this? To figure that out, we actually need to rewind a bit.
Centuries of changing hands. To really decode today's mystery, we absolutely have to look back at the island's pretty turbulent history. Because Taiwan hasn't just existed in a vacuum, right? It's changed hands a lot over the last 300 years.
It's basically a rapid-fire succession of rulers. You've got the Dutch in the 17th century, then the Qing dynasty, and then the Japanese Empire. But the real game changer? That happens right after World War II in 1945. Control of Taiwan gets handed over to Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese nationalists and a major American ally. But here's the catch. Chiang was in the middle of a massive, brutal civil war against the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong. Fast forward to 1949, the communists win, they found the People's Republic of China on the mainland, and Chiang Kai-shek, he and his nationalist forces, along with over 1 million refugees, basically pack up and flee across the strait to Taiwan.
Okay, so here is the absolutely crucial point. That civil war, it never officially ended with a peace treaty. So that 1949 split effectively left the world staring at two Chinas. You had the new communist government in Beijing claiming to be the sole legitimate representative of all of China, which to them included Taiwan. But meanwhile, the nationalist government that retreated to Taipei, they also claimed to be the legitimate representative of the entire country, mainland included. It was this massive constitutional standoff, and it totally set the stage for decades of conflict.
The Cold War shift. Now, this wasn't just some localized dispute anymore. The whole narrative flipped in the 1950s because the entire globe was plunging headfirst into the Cold War.
In 1950, North Korea, who had the backing of the Soviet Union and China, invades the South. Suddenly, the U.S. is looking around thinking, oh wow, communism is actively on the march in Asia. Stopping that expansion instantly became America's ultimate global priority. And because of that, Taiwan overnight becomes this incredibly vital non-communist ally on the global chessboard. Now, to be clear, Chiang Kai-shek was running Taiwan as a really harsh dictatorship at this point, imprisoning and executing his opponents. But because he shared America's fierce anti-communist stance, the U.S. embraced him anyway, and even stationed thousands of American troops right there on the island for the next 20 years.
The Sino-Soviet split. But then, plot twist, global politics experiences a seismic shift. America's two biggest communist rivals, the Soviet Union and China, start severely fracturing their relationship.
And the United States, they saw an incredible strategic opportunity to exploit that division. Up until this point, the U.S. had completely refused to even recognize the communist government in Beijing. But President Richard Nixon does this stunning pivot. Driven by a shared desire to counterbalance the Soviets, Nixon actually opens relations with China. He famously said, there can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people. Just like that, China was suddenly no longer the enemy.
But for Taiwan, oh man, this was absolute diplomatic whiplash. The rest of the international community quickly followed America's lead. In a historic vote, the United Nations literally took the seat representing mainland China away from Taiwan and handed it straight over to the People's Republic of China. The reaction in Taiwan was visceral and super emotional. They felt totally betrayed, with one reaction being, now we are being deserted, we are being forsaken.
1979, the normalization of U.S.-China relations. The diplomatic dominoes kept falling. By 1979, the US and China officially normalized their relationship. But Beijing had one strict, non-negotiable condition. If the US wanted formal ties with China, they had to officially drop their diplomatic relations with Taiwan and pull all their troops off the island. And the US agreed.
Now, back in Washington, a lot of politicians felt like this was a complete betrayal of a longtime ally. So Congress steps in and passes a law mandating that the US government must continue selling weapons to Taiwan so the island can defend itself. But they deliberately drew a line at promising direct military intervention. This perfectly illustrates our central concept, strategic ambiguity. It's the official US policy of supplying Taiwan with defensive weapons without clearly, legally promising direct military intervention if Taiwan gets attacked. Would they? Probably, but it's not legally certain. This brilliant yet incredibly strange legal loophole is exactly what keeps the whole geopolitical stalemate hanging in the balance even today.
1990s, Taiwan embraces democracy. So while American policy has basically been frozen in that ambiguity since 1979, Taiwan absolutely has not. Moving into the 90s, the island completely transformed. They moved away from dictatorship, modernized into a flourishing democracy, and officially dropped their historical claim to represent the entirety of China.
China's position, however, remains rock solid. Taiwan is part of China. Beijing states they desire a peaceful unification, but they absolutely refuse to rule out using force. And they back that up. China routinely runs these massive military exercises right in the seas surrounding the island. Now, U.S. intelligence agencies report that while an invasion doesn't appear imminent today, Chinese leadership is actively building up the military capabilities required to seize Taiwan if they choose to do so. From Beijing's perspective, reunifying with Taiwan is this critical test of their ability to break through what they view as Western containment.
The first island chain. Okay, to really grasp why this matters so much globally, let's zoom out to the macro stakes. Look at Taiwan's geography. It sits dead center in what military strategists call the first island chain. Basically, it's a string of islands connecting massive U.S. military bases in Japan and South Korea, down through bases they have access to in the Philippines. Taiwan is the literal linchpin holding that all together.
And then there are the economic stakes, which are just staggering. 1/5, fully 1/5 of all global sea trade passes directly through the contested Taiwan Strait. If a conflict broke out here, it wouldn't just be a political crisis, it would be a catastrophic bottleneck for the entire global economy. But the economic stakes actually go way deeper than shipping lanes. Enter the Silicon Shield. This is a crucial modern concept. Taiwan's biggest protection against an invasion today might not just be its weapons, but its absolute dominance in advanced microchip manufacturing, which is driven by a single company, TSMC. It's wild, but the geopolitical tension is directly wired into the tiny microchips powering the exact device you're using to watch this explainer right now.
The vast majority of the world's most advanced chips are made solely in Taiwan. Analysts warn that if Taiwan were blockaded or if its manufacturing capacity got destroyed in a war, it would trigger an absolute economic apocalypse worldwide. Because everyone relies on this company, attacking Taiwan basically means attacking the entire global tech supply chain, and that acts as a massive deterrent. But both superpowers are getting nervous. The US is urgently trying to reduce its reliance by helping TSMC build new fabrication plants in places like Arizona, while China is pouring money into jumpstarting its own domestic chip manufacturing.
The Taiwanese perspective. All right, we've talked a ton about superpower chess here, but let's bring the narrative down to the human level. What about the 23 million people who actually live on this island? What do they want?
Well, polling actually gives us a crystal clear picture of how the public has adapted to this wild reality. First off, most people on the island today identify strictly as Taiwanese, not Chinese. And despite all the headlines, polling also shows the majority don't actually believe a Chinese invasion is imminent. But here is the most fascinating takeaway. The majority actively support the status quo. They don't want to declare formal independence, which could trigger a war, but they definitely don't want unification with Beijing either. They actively prefer to live in this ambiguous, yet relatively stable and secure gray area. The ambiguity works for them.
So, over the decades, the US, China, and Taiwan have preserved peace precisely through a willingness to accept these overlapping ambiguities. But as we leave you today, we have to ask, can the world maintain this delicate balance of ambiguities as superpower competition heats up? As the US and China continue to clash over trade, technology, and global influence, this 300-year-old balancing act is going to be tested like never before. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning what you see on the global stage.